This exemplar focuses on the figurative learning design, which comprises of a number of different components commonly used in higher education teaching, for example metaphor, simile and analogy, whereby usually a difficult idea or concept is explained by comparison with something the student or the learner is already familiar with. This is the final design in the Learning Designs framework, and the example we're going to look at features an interview from the News Film Online collection, one of the early television interviews, filmed in 1961, featuring an American scientist called Dr. Donald Glaser and a British interviewer. And I'll play a little bit of the video to give you a flavour for what we mean by figurative.
Dr. Glaser, it's been said that you first had this idea watching beer fizz in a bottle. Is this true?
No, it's not true at all, really. We did, in fact, do some experiments using bottles of beer to see whether we could make beer foam more with a radioactive source than without. But the basic idea of trying to see particles flying through a liquid by photographing the streamers of bubbles came before the beer experiments.
Yes. How long did it take you to build your first chamber?
Well, the first one was a very simple device. It took maybe a couple of months and was intended only to test the fundamental idea, which seemed quite wild at the time.
Did you have enough money for it?
It didn't need much money, and what we needed, a few $100s we got from the University of Michigan.
How big was it?
It was about the size of the last joint of your thumb, an inch long or so.
What's the size of the biggest chamber that's now being built?
Well, the chambers have grown very large. The largest in the world that is in operation now is about the size of an ordinary bathtub. But when it's surrounded with all of its associated equipment, it's a good deal larger than a two-story house.
Are you going to go on building bigger and better bubble chambers in the future?
No, I don't think I'm going to build any more bubble chambers for a while. I'm getting kind of tired of that line of work.
I think that gives you a flavour for the kind of exercise that we were looking at. Now, originally, we'd imagine that kind of interview clip, which is fairly typical of early news interviews, might be used to encourage students in, for instance, the sciences to predict what he's actually talking about as a kind of stimulus, using some of the earliest stimulus designs that we've already explained. But quite interestingly, in one of the workshops which we ran to trial these materials, an academic from a completely different discipline, in actual fact English, pointed out that it would be a really useful resource to use as a kind of metaphor, and he felt it was metaphorically or analogously a good example of the kind of relationship that had developed between the United States and Britain in the post-war period, particularly in the late 50s and early 60s, as Britain was beginning to come to terms with its downgraded size, no longer a superpower, and of course America was doing just the opposite and beginning to flex its muscle as the world superpower. And this relationship, he felt, was mirrored by the relationship here between the British interviewer, rather stiff and starchy, obsessed with money for instance, and the American scientist, very much more laconic, very laid back, relatively relaxed, not concerned about the finance at all, but nonetheless in control. So we've actually focused a number of examples around the figurative use of digital video clips, and in this example, this is actual example of two academics discussing a clip about the early prototype helicopters. You can see the same kind of activity taking place, whereby an analogy is actually referred to in order to understand the process of helicopter development.
I was to say, could we do an activity then that relates to how something like this illustrates how we have to go through a series of gradual steps to get to the end point that we want, i.e. and make that comparable to Web 2 technologies, today's technologies. Yep. Conversation at dinner last night about Second Life and its merits or its non-merits, depends which side of the camp you sit on, and somebody said that it's a step we have to go through to get to the next step, which is actual real virtualization and not avatars anymore, if you like. And it's just an intermediary step that once we get real people and real pictures in there, that people will be actually begin to engage with it more. Yeah. And that actually illustrates some of that quite nicely. But
I I think that's a really good example of what we mean by figurative, whereby the use of Second Life as the analogy would explain to students the development of prototype helicopters, which at the time may have seemed completely ludicrous and impossible in terms of flight, but they are a step, or the early prototypes were a step that was necessary in order to achieve full flight. So that's what we're terming the figurative learning design.